And God is raising up a whole new order of something in his kingdom. It's called the order of Melchizedek. And the old order has ended because the old fivefold ministry order was never supposed to bring government to the church. It took on a governmental role of ruling when actually the reality is it was supposed to equip the church, to equip the saints for service, not do it for the saints. And that old order has ended because they didn't do what God called them to do, majority of wise, which is equipping people. See, prophets shouldn't have been going around prophesying over everyone and doing prophetic conferences where everyone got their word from God. I mean, how many people have been to a prophetic conference? A few of you. Why did you go? To get a word from God. If they'd been teaching you to get a word from God, to hear God for yourself, then they would have been doing what they were called to do. But rather than teaching people, they did it for them and became someone that became dependent on. And that whole order of ministry created people who started to rule and be on top of the church, and people had to go to them to get to God rather than being led to go to God direct. So apostles, rather than helping people to go to heaven and get their own destiny, just started producing coverings of visions, and you had to come under their covering, otherwise you couldn't get to engage in these things. So that order's ended. God is not in that, and we're going to see some real powerful changes in that whole order as things get shaken up. Now, because God is desiring a government which is foundational, not above. So that whole Moses and Joshua generation, the Moses generation stayed in the wilderness and they died. And they were all dependent on Moses. Moses hit the water, the rock and water came out. Moses went up the mountain to see God. Moses parted the Red Sea. But in the Joshua generation order, Joshua didn't part the Jordan. They just stepped into it with the presence of God in the ark, and the waters parted. Joshua didn't bring down the walls of Jericho. They got a strategy from heaven, and they walked around it, and the walls came down. So it's a totally different dimension between Moses and Joshua, and the Joshua and the Moses generation, and being in the wilderness and building something in the wilderness to crossing over. Because God actually never asked them to build anything in the wilderness. They were supposed to live and follow the cloud and the pillar. Now, of course, they could have entered the promised land straight away, but they chose not to, and they died in the wilderness. So many ministries are building mountains in the wilderness and are not prepared to move. Now God is saying to move, to cross over. So we're in a really transitional period right now where the old order is being exposed and the new order is being revealed. So Joshua and the Joshua generation were forerunners who were called to mentor the next generation and take them into the land. And Joshua and Caleb were pretty old. They're in their 80s. And the whole generation that went with them as men of war were 20 to 59. Because all those that were 20 and over, other than Joshua and Caleb, died in the wilderness. God wants to raise up a generation who are going to reach their generation and encourage them to come into the things of God and to encourage them to embrace their inheritance in God. So I believe we're called to be part of that Joshua generation. The only qualification for being part of the Joshua generation is you have to have been through the wilderness. Well, most of us have been through the wilderness. Even young people have been through the wilderness, and we're called to come out of that wilderness and come into the promise. And the Joshua generation is a forerunner generation, because Joshua and Caleb spied out the land. So God is looking for people who will spy out this land beyond the veil, engage heaven, and then bring a good report. Not a bad one, because the others brought a bad report. Hey, there's giants in the land, and we're grasshoppers in their sight and ours. So they didn't recognize their authority in who they were, and therefore they didn't enter. So God is looking for people to enter into heaven, go beyond the veil, experience there what it is to be a son of God and to have an inheritance, and then give a good report that will call people to enter in and embrace their inheritance. So forerunners, embracing the progressive revelation of God's kingdom. God's kingdom is progressively being revealed. So we can't stay in the old. There's no end to the increase of his government. Everything's expanding. So if we stay where we are, we're going to miss where the cloud and the glory goes. So we're called to leave the old religious institutional ways and embrace new kingdom ways. And that is challenging, because sometimes we've just been ingrained with old ways. And when we get challenged to new ways, there's a little bit of shaking goes on. and some disturbance that goes on, but God is calling us to cross over.
Get more from Mike when you join any tier at patreon.com/freedomark.
So if you're going to cross over, what sort of people do you need to be? Well, the Joshua generation people had a different spirit. They weren't content to be settlers. They had to be pioneers. They needed more. Because their inheritance was going to be the land, not some wilderness. So I've done a teaching on Joshua generation's 40 characteristics that I received by revelation when I was on the fast. You can look at it. I haven't got time to go into it all today. Essentially, God calls people who are apostolic, who have a vision, to follow it, to go first, to be willing to embrace where no one else has gone, to boldly go where no man has gone before. But we have to be centered in Jesus. We're not chasing experience here. We're looking for a relationship that opens up the experience, but we're looking for a relationship with a person. We need to be lovers of creation because God has given us a call to respond to the whole of the created order. So we can't be just interested in our own lives. It's bigger than that. So pioneers, adventurers, servant leaders who are going to serve people, not try and rule over them. Disciplers who are going to pass on what they've received, not hold it to themselves because knowledge is power, but to freely give what they freely received. Colossians 3:1-2 says this, "Therefore, if you have been raised up with Christ, keep seeking things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above." Now, people sort of, well, you don't want to be so heavenly minded, you're no earthly good. Well, those are people who've never been to heaven. Because when you go to heaven, you're much more earthly good than if you're tethered to this earth. So we're not just to think about things on the earth. And most of our time is spent looking at all the problems and the world. When you look above, you see things from a totally different perspective. You see things from God's perspective. And once you start engaging with the four faces of God, you can see the perspective of the lion and the ox and the eagle and the man. Completely different revelation. This is the principal key revelatory principle of what God is doing, to keep focused on above. God is raising up this whole Joshua generation of leaders, mentors, disciples, so that they will be committed to leading people into that dimension, a supernatural lifestyle. And supernatural lifestyle isn't just miracles, signs, and wonders and things. Jesus did those, and we're supposed to do those things. But we're supposed to have a greater dimension of authority than just that. Those were just the works of the kingdom. Jesus said the kingdom was at hand because he was there. And he lived in both places at once, heaven and earth. John 3:13. So the kingdom was at hand. So the works of the kingdom were all the things that the rule of God enabled to take place. We see the works and we think that's the kingdom. It's just the works without work from the rule. So we have to learn to rule. So whatever we freely receive, let's be a blessing and release it to draw more and more people into it. So we need to get alongside people. We need to equip people into that lifestyle. You're not going to do it without relationship. God's calling us to go deeper with him, to be willing to experience new things, not afraid. Because when they went into the promised land, they'd never been there before. Abraham was called to go and seek a city. This architect and builder would be God, and he'd never been. God always calls us to take a step of faith into something that we've never been. I've just been up in Oregon, and it's like at the end of the Oregon Trail, those guys didn't have a map. They just went, and they had to wind their way through mountains and valleys and rivers, but they were pioneers. They're willing to go first. Why? Because people are coming behind. God is looking for people who are willing to say, I'll go. I might not know where I'm going, but I'm going to be obedient and I'm going to follow. And I guess you're here because you want to be that sort of people. You're going to lead others that will follow, and then you lead them into even more. And then they can lead others into even more.
Help take the message of God's unconditional love to all his children when you join any tier at patreon.com/freedomark.
If you enjoy these videos, would you please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe? It really does help. Thank you very much.